Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change. I've stopped listing them. I used to do that when we were in the pandemic, and we have global warming, and we have the information pollution crisis. So we'll skip all that. I'm Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What episode, I don't know, 700 something. And what I try to do here is get a little clarity amid the confusion, and through conversation, and knowing that no particular conversation solves the problem on these wicked issues we're surrounded by. And I'm really happy to catch up with two friends and brains that I've relied on for a long time, who poke at tough questions and come up with provocative answers. And I mean, John Horgan and I go back, our roots go back in parallel 40 years in the science journalism world. And I've been wanting to get you on here for a while. We also lived for a long time in the Hudson Valley in the same area, same town. And Steve Fuller, I've met off and on through the decades at various science-a-thons. You are, as John has pointed out in his writing, you are a provocateur with you come out with data and with the skills of a philosopher, and with the understanding of social behavior that's pretty unparalleled, certainly unexceeded. So it's great to have you both in conversation. You've poked at each other before, and we're going to start in. The idea here is to explore some of the themes you've each touched on. Clearly, artificial intelligence, or as Chris Mims said recently on this show, it's really synthetic intelligence. It's simulated intelligence, and that's something we can talk about. The End of Truth, the state of our information environment. Steve has a new book out on media and power and knowledge. And you see this on a micro scale every day now with the CBS. The ownership of CBS is power, and it's changing the information that flows through that particular channel into people's living rooms or computers and more. So the first step here is to get, for those who are not as familiar with you two as I am, to dig in a little bit on you. So Steve, just the usual question I ask is going to be too tough. It's how did you become who you are so far, and to do it in like 30 or 40 seconds? What is it that drives you, Steve? What causes you to focus on particular questions and with your approach? Just explain a little bit about who Steve Fuller is in that sense.
Okay, so I'm someone who has a PhD in history and philosophy of science, undergraduate degree in history and sociology, and I've always been interested in the nature of knowledge. But in a way, the nature of knowledge has usually been analyzed in two separate ways that often are not connected to each other. One of them is, you might say, the historical or empirical way, where you actually look at the facts about how knowledge is actually produced and how it's been produced throughout the ages and so forth. But of course, especially from a philosophical and policy standpoint, you're interested in the question of how knowledge ought to be produced, right? Under what conditions, and what counts as knowledge, right? Conditions of validity, things like that. And so relatively early in my career, I founded this journal and wrote the first book on the topic of social epistemology, which is about the social foundations of knowledge in both senses, but basically trying to take what we know about the empirical and historical character of knowledge and sort of project it into what can it say about, what knowledge can be, what it ought to be, and so forth. And this then brings in the questions of the relationship between knowledge and power, which are very familiar. And so those ideas have always been very prominent in my mind. And when we talk about the current period, the period in which we're talking about the end of science, for example, there's obviously been some very significant changes that have taken place in the way in which knowledge has been produced, especially our most esteemed form of knowledge, scientific knowledge. And some of it has to do with technology. Some of it has to do with the changing political economy of science, especially with the end of the Cold War. And of course, a lot has had to do with the perceived effects that science and technology have so far had on society, not all of which have been great. And so there's also a change of attitude, you might say, in terms of how we should be going about producing and evaluating knowledge. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of how I set up my stall.
Yeah, and lately, anyone who thinks about who gets into a position of power and what they see as knowledge has been in the United States completely exploded
That's
compared to
right.
to what I grew up with. So the power is framed by how well part of Trump's power, I think, has been through how he can create a knowledge base for people who have certain portals to the world. Is that fair to say? Is that kind of
Well, I certainly
an
think
example, I guess?
Well, I certainly think, this is where the technological side becomes very important, especially social media and the use of social media. In terms of that particular sort of channeling of knowledge for, you might say, a specific ideological purpose or to cater to a certain kind of worldview, I suppose the pioneer in that approach in the recent past would be Andrew Breitbart. In terms of taking news feeds and then spinning them right in a certain kind of way ideologically, and he was quite deliberate about it. And it was through Breitbart that, of course, we got Steve Bannon, right, who was very instrumental in the first Trump administration. Yeah, and the thing is, the availability of this new social media technology and the way in which you can take stuff that are coming through news feeds, right? We used to call them what like press agencies and things like this, right? And then
Right.
and then add, as it were, a kind of ideological superstructure to whatever you're talking about, and then just send it out to subscribers. I think this is kind of the model, right? That in a way, Truth Social now functions, and you needed that kind of social media technology to really be able to have that kind of an effect that's been so decisive for both politics and the way in which we think about knowledge.
Yeah. So John, you and I grew up in this thing called journalism when we thought we were the proprietor of knowledge. There was kind of a professorial aspect to it. We were basically, it was all unidirectional. We would go out there and ingest information, and we would pump it out and maybe get 10 letters to the editor and go on to the next story. Do you see that model as just basically extinct? You still write a blog. I do too. You write wonderful essays that are coherent and well argued, but are we just like in this shrinking node in this explosive arena of other kinds of stuff?
Yeah, things are so much worse than I ever thought they would be right now. Just to answer the question you put to Steve, so where am I coming from? I started out as like a hippie spiritual seeker. I was a dropout. I rejected the whole system of capitalism that I grew up in. I grew up in an affluent town in Connecticut. I was interested in gurus who were peddling enlightenment and LSD and things like that. And I had this idea that there was some kind of giant revelation out there waiting for me where I would understand everything. I gave that up eventually, not entirely, but I sort of set it aside and decided that science was our best hope for understanding the world, and I had always been interested in science, but I also wanted to be a writer. Eventually, I realized there was this thing called science writing that was perfectly suited for me.
Right.
And I originally became a journalist. I was right behind you at Columbia Journalism School in the early '80s,
Yeah.
and my original idea of science journalism was, as you say, talking to the scientists, hearing what they had to say, conveying their profound discoveries to the public and putting it in terms that the public could understand. I became pretty disillusioned with that within, I don't know, by the end of the '80s and early '90s, and started just thinking there was a lot of bullshit in science, too much hype. And so I began to specialize in pointing out what I thought were gaps between some of the grandiose claims that scientists were making and the reality. And that culminated, and one of the grandiose claims was that scientists were on the verge of understanding everything, understanding reality. This came from people like Stephen Hawking and Francis Crick and Richard Dawkins. And I wrote The End of Science in part to debunk that, to celebrate science, and to say science has told us a lot about how nature works, about the history of the universe and life on Earth, and it's uncovered the basic structure of reality, the laws that govern physical reality. But some of these great mysteries, like where the universe came from and how life began on Earth, and how consciousness, the greatest mystery of all, is produced by matter, I argued will never be solved. And I also, the core argument of The End of Science was that the great discoveries in pure science, which is just trying to understand the world, not manipulate it, are behind us in the form of relativity and quantum mechanics and evolutionary theory, the whole DNA-based genetics that we have today. We're not going to top that. But not to jump too far ahead, so I'll just wrap it up by saying I just assumed that civilization would still care about science for its own sake, care about science as a form of illumination and understanding of the world. And I've just concluded over the last 5 years, and it's just been growing on me lately, that humanity doesn't really give a shit about understanding and illumination. It has always all been about power, with the quest for truth as kind of marketing and window dressing. My view of the future of science and even of civilization is quite dark right now.
Steve, what color in the light dark spectrum is your view?
Purple.
Yeah, right.
Purple. But no, God, what to say? One of the things, here, let me give a somewhat more positive spin on what's going on now, and of course the kind of perspective that John is giving, I think, is a very natural perspective, given the kind of situation that we're in, where there is a lot of questioning about science, and people talk even about an anti-science feeling. I see it differently. I in fact see that the sort of upset that people have about science and technology is actually about kind of the issue that John is raising, namely that the way in which science has become so intimately involved with issues of power, right, and institutional standing, that this has actually had a very corrosive and even perverted effect on the way in which science can proceed. Right. So in other words, the way I see what's being called an anti-science attitude today is something like the Protestant Reformation's attitude toward the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church was being seen as corrupt. Right. So and I think one of the ways that you could see, again, this may be rose-tinted spectacles from the standpoint of John, but I think this is one way to look at somebody like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Okay, that there's a sense in which we're going to purge the establishment of all these people who've been taking money from the pharmaceutical industries for a long time, right? And that's been directing their science. And the whole idea of being able to look at the scientific evidence, with plain eyes that are unfiltered by big bucks, right, has disappeared from the scientific establishment itself. So what you need to do is to bring in the outsiders, the people who have been historically marginalized, at least in the recent past, and bring them into the center, and then you will get a pure form of science, right? And certainly Robert F. Kennedy's rhetoric is of this kind, and I think you find this in common. And I would put this against another background condition that makes our situation kind of interesting and unique, is namely we are living in a time where we have more and more people who hold science degrees of one sort or another and have taken an interest in science, even at the popular level, right? I mean, there's a question about what exactly they're reading about science when they're, as it were, pursuing their interest in science. But nevertheless, the interest in science is extremely strong. Right? It's just highly diversified in the way it's manifested and the sources that people are going to, right? But nevertheless, the interest is there. And so I think we live in a time where people are more than ever concerned about the nature of science and technology. And that is the source of all the criticism that the establishment is facing. But, Protestant Reformation didn't lead to the end of Christianity. And I think this is kind of the way I would look at this situation that we're in now at the moment. It's a kind of transitional situation.
Yeah, can I respond to that?
Of course, yeah. No, this is a conversation.
So I admit that one thing that especially troubles me right now, and this is what and just this morning, Steve, I reread this great essay of yours that you published in December on you referenced my book, The End of Science, and used it to argue, to present a positive view of what's happening with artificial intelligence. And I've got to admit, I'm horrified by AI. It's bringing out the Luddite in me. And I love technology. I love the internet, and I'm on my MacBook right now talking to you guys, and I've got an iPhone over here, and I can do amazing stuff with these technologies. I can write something and have people telling me what an idiot I am within minutes now, which is quite extraordinary compared to how Andy and I started our careers in journalism back in the 80s. But I see AI, I don't give a shit about like the rise of the machines and whether AIs are sentient. I think there's a lot of nonsense being spouted now, actually by people I respect, philosophers and so on, about the philosophical implications of AI. Should they have rights if we decide that they're sentient and capable of suffering? I see this as a technology that is being foisted on us by extremely powerful corporations run by men who now are in this unholy alliance with this totally corrupt, power-mad administration overseen by, our modern Caligula, Donald Trump. So, and what I see AI doing to my university, to my students, and to my colleagues is undermining intellectual work, providing a substitute for thinking, which to me is the whole point of writing and science and philosophy. It's understanding. It's having these flashes of illumination, even if the illumination end up leaving you more confused. Then there's the whole military dimension of artificial intelligence and all the other technologies. There's now this arms race in AI going on between the US and China, but lots of other countries are also involved now. So I just don't see good out at this point. Steve, I would love to I want you to convince me that I'm being too pessimistic. I hate being pessimistic. I'm a natural optimist, but I'm really struggling lately. If you can convince me that I'm alarmist, and we haven't even talked about climate change, which like nobody even gives a shit about anymore. We're not even talking about it anymore. I want to come away from this conversation feeling a little more upbeat about the future of humanity.
Okay, can I respond to that? At a certain level, I feel your pain. But let me start. I'm going to start by saying something positive, at least about the American tech companies vis-a-vis the Chinese tech companies, because one of the things that I think, and again, this is not meant to be an advertisement for Silicon Valley or something, but I would say that those guys who are running it, and here I would reference Alex Karp's recent book, The Technological Republic, are kind of very cautious about exactly how they want to position themselves with regard to the state, because in a sense, like you say, China is seen as kind of the enemy in some sense. And one of the things I think the Silicon Valley people are very concerned about is about the United States turning into the mirror image of China, basically, by the tech companies and the state becoming interlocked in such a strong way. So there is a kind of looseness of fit that I think is quite deliberately being maintained by the Silicon Valley companies with regard to the state. And this is certainly true in Europe, I would say. Though in Europe, it's coming more from the state side, I would say. So there's that. So I'm not worried that we're going to turn into China. That would be the first point. But in terms of the more the kind of basic point about the way in which artificial intelligence might be eroding our intellectual life or debasing it by, in a sense, in an unwitting way, de-skilling us, right, through persistent use. Now, it is true that persistent use of technologies do tend to get rid of certain skills that people used to perform before the technologies were around, right? I mean, that's a general truth, and I'm sure that certain kinds of practices, and I am concerned about this because, as you know, I teach students on a regular basis, and the extent to which they are offloading various cognitive skills to the machine, and given the kinds of machines we're talking about, the generative artificial intelligence machines, it's often very difficult to tell when they've been doing the offloading because, in a sense, the machines themselves have a kind of creative might be a strong word, but the point is they do their own thing, right? They don't just reproduce certain stock answers or things, right? They are always coming up with novel combinations, which makes it very difficult to see the extent to which it's been influencing the student's thought. So there is that. That is a real issue. The thing I would say, though, and this goes back to the way you began, where you were referencing this article of mine that I recently wrote, which does present artificial intelligence in a positive light. Part of the focus of that article was on the fact that even though we have this enormous amount of scientific material, and I mean scientific in the broad sense to include the humanities and social sciences, that is, as it were, in principle at least publicly available, relatively little of it actually gets utilized. And the reason why relatively little of it gets utilized is because of the way in which professional scientists and professional academics generally are conditioned to read the material. So in a sense, part of what we do when we're professionals is we systematically ignore most of the stuff that's out there because we're focusing on the stuff that our disciplines regard as the research frontier. Okay, but what that means is up to 80% of all the material that's actually published, and perfectly reasonable material, right, gets ignored systematically. Of course, those publications often help these academics who write them to get tenure and promotion and all that other stuff you need to do, right, to stay in business as an academic, but they don't actually contribute cognitively, right, to the advancement of knowledge, even though they're there waiting to be read. Now, this is where generative AI comes in, because generative AI, you front loaded with all this data, right, which the human beings have been ignoring, right? And then you might actually come up with something novel, not novel in the sense of out of nowhere, but novel in the sense of bringing together things that have been already published, but have never been put together in this very particular way because there's been no institutional incentive within academia to do so. And that is the kind of thing that I'm pointing to.
Yeah, that is, again, that's something I'd like to believe. When I was reading that part of your essay, I'm thinking replication crisis, John Ioannidis and a statistical analysis of the peer-reviewed scientific literature, which showed that a majority of papers cannot be corroborated, or they're exaggerated, they're profoundly flawed in some way. I'm assuming that that's just gotten worse over time. I see careerism as having replaced the ideal of the quest for truth among scientists. Sorry to drag Epstein in, but I see the whole Epstein affair as, and I wrote about this for Scientific American back in 2019 when he was re-imprisoned and then died. I mean, John Brockman, this agent who introduced Epstein to lots of famous scientists, he used to be my agent. So I was pretty close to that whole Epstein scene. And I saw everything that happened. I mean, even back then, now the revelations are much worse than I could have imagined. I see that as part of this kind of rot in science that appalls me. And that I think, and again, it's taken us away from the quest for truth, this sort of noble ideal of science, towards something that's sort of tawdry. And so the idea of AI, a lot of the claims that are being made for AI right now, including what you just said, reminds me of some of the hype for big data going back about 15 years.
Yeah.
And scientists were saying, we're going to use these giant databases and come up with all these amazing correlations that mere humans couldn't discover. I think we're just going to get a tsunami of false positives now, of bullshit pseudo theories coming out of these examinations of the literature.
Can I inject something? Wait, Steve, before you go, I want to inject something. The other thing, you're only talking so far about science that's published, and that leaves out the science that hasn't been done because of what I call what's been called the streetlight effect. There's huge parts of the world that aren't investigated scientifically because they're dangerous or poor, and there's no incentive. There are questions that are not dug in on because there's no incentive within the existing system of science, and I think AI, if asked the right prompts, can help flag that stuff. Right. It's like, I did a show a few years ago on Wikipedia, how Wikipedia works, and it's still mostly human beings. They're starting to think about incorporating AI into Wikipedia to sort of where you could sort of like have a color coding, like a red sheen over Wikipedia entries or science studies that are not replicated or have other issues, where AI can sort of give us, if we want it, a view of that part of the landscape. Yeah,
that's encouraging. Actually, I hadn't heard that.
Wait, which thing?
I said that's what you just said about how AI could be used to make Wikipedia more sophisticated and sort of grade the reliability of certain claims. I like that. That's
well.
By the way, I just asked Grok while we were talking. I said, can generative AI help identify unreplicated research and gaps in what science has studied?
Yes.
And there's a big yes and lots of answers there.
Well, if first of all, I think the replication crisis that John was referring to, which is real, I would say is kind of an artifact of the fact that the research frontiers of so many areas are quite narrow, and so it becomes very competitive. And so you want to be the first person in that area that everybody's looking at and trying to get money for to do, the brilliant thing. And so that leads people to cut corners and to make up findings and stuff like that. Now, if in fact the scientific effort was spread more broadly across all the possible domains that one could be studying, there would probably be less incentive to commit this kind of fraud, which is very closely related to very competitive cutting edge areas, right? It's not happening in areas where there's not a lot of money to be found, right? There's not a Nobel Prize to be got, right? Those areas don't have this kind of problem, right? It's in certain kinds of specific areas. The other thing I would say with regard to the Wikipedia and AI thing, which I hadn't heard about either, is I'll make a prediction here. I actually think generative AI is going to put Wikipedia out of business. And that's because you can basically get customized Wikipedia style answers, you might say.
I'm showing you right Wikipedia.
Right, there's Grokpedia already, right? I mean, because Wikipedia is actually quite a laborious thing to maintain, precisely because it's human-based, right? I mean, in that respect, right? Wikipedia is kind of old-fashioned crowdsourcing. And it involves people interacting with each other and getting into all kinds of disputes and stuff like this. There I am. I'm one of the people who hopes Wikipedia, this page for me is a good example of why Wikipedia should go, because it's basically written by my enemies, because they're the ones who are most persistent in the edits. I mean, the one redeeming feature about Wikipedia, which is something, by the way, generative AI doesn't have, at least not at this point, is you can actually track the history, right, of all the different versions of the Wikipedia articles. So you can actually follow all the debates and arguments and everything else about it. Whereas with generative AI, right, it's hard to generate a paper trail from it, right? Everything's just kind of recreated anew with each prompt. And so that could have, in the long term, some very serious consequences for the way in which knowledge is, a sense of collective ownership, a sense of collective memory, right? All of that actually could be pretty much radically transformed through the extensive use of generative artificial intelligence.
I just got to point out, my Wikipedia page also is heavily written influenced by my enemies. So you'd think that the most important thing I ever wrote was this article called "The Death of Proof" for Scientific American in the early '90s. The mathematicians flipped out, and they're still hating on me because of that article, even though they're citing it in their own publications. It's the mathematicians and also the white supremacists, the racists who I accuse of using pseudoscience to bolster their case that, you know, certain races are superior to others, and the sexists, Charles Murray, people like that.
It's true. Wikipedia is very soft on eugenics and things like this. Wikipedia is very soft on those topics.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So if AI can, I mean, if AI can improve my, I don't know, my public page somehow, then I guess I'm all for it.
Because that's what really matters. Yeah. You know, but then of course it all gets down to who use. Well, yeah, with Grok, you know, there were all the issues with the algorithms being tinkered with, and why was it interested in Nazis and all that stuff. I do think there are these two big questions. John, you got at this, I think, a few minutes ago, that you're less worried about this sort of existential questions about AI taking over the world and more about these sort of discrete possibilities and problems. And that takes us back to the bigger issue of science, the utility of science, and or the questions with science. One of Steve, one of your, you know, longstanding points has been kind of an enthusiasm for breakthroughs, an enthusiasm for letting the machine roll, and technology, you know, transhumanism, which we are all transhuman now, right?
That's right.
It's like it's a scale of where you are in that journey. The precaution thing really is something that fascinates me. Precaution or exuberance, is, you know, I'm mostly exuberant about science, but you know, on these certain issues, and sometimes it's the interface of issues like AI plus the renewal of nuclear war. You know, I do worry seriously about the human prospect in many ways. I've been reading a lot about the Great Filter. You know, I'm going to have Adam Frank on here later in March to talk again about the longevity of civilizations, and is our technical prowess always going to be way out in front of our ability to really understand its full scope? So how do you weigh that reality with the exuberance? Here, you know, I was at the Vatican in 2014 for this week-long meeting on sustainable humanity, sustainable nature, our responsibility. And this guy, this Honduran cardinal, Maradiaga, opened this meeting by saying, nowadays man finds himself to be a technical giant and an ethical child. And that rings in my head a lot these days. So can you talk about your enthusiasm for diving in, for people becoming test subjects, for all that stuff, and then this concept as well?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this business about our being, you know, technological giants and ethical children is an old one, right? I mean, in a sense, this is not just of our time. This is something, you know, everyone said,
Right.
you know, through all of the various technological revolutions that we've gone through. And in a sense, I don't want to say that means you should take it with a grain of salt, but there's a sense in which we've managed through, right? I mean, I think one of the when we think about the ethical side in the way you've presented it, Andrew, I think we need to imagine, when we think about future generations, that their baseline about what counts as a good life will be whatever they're born into. Yeah. Right. So in other words, they will not be thinking like us, just like we're not thinking like Aristotle. Right. I mean, you know, and so I do think that there's sometimes what I would regard as kind of a temporal illusion, where we get very hyped up about future generations because, you know, we're imagining that the future generations may not have all of the things that we have now, but we don't have all the things that the previous generations have had either, and we're moving along fine. Right? So there is that aspect to this, right? That there is a sense in which the value system will be different in the future. And so the idea that we want to somehow keep a constancy of what it means to be human and live an adequate human life, I think that may be illusory, and that shouldn't be so much part of the argument. But there is an issue here about how you face the uncertainty of the future. And this gets to the business of the precautionary principle versus what I've proposed, the proactionary principle. And so these are two different attitudes toward risk, right? And the precautionary principle, you could trace it back to the Hippocratic Oath. Above all, cause no harm, right? So it's a harm avoidance approach to risk because you treat uncertainty under those conditions as potential threat. Right. So you set very high standards with regard to regulation for new technologies, right? Stuff like that. The European Union actually has a version of the precautionary principle built into its environmental regulations. The other is the thing that is associated with transhumanism, and that is the proactionary principle. And the proactionary principle treats risk as an opportunity. Right. So in other words, so you treat it, as like a fair throw of the dice almost. Right. In other words, you adopt the attitude kind of the way entrepreneurs do. Right. When they see a sort of uncertain situation, they're going to make something out of it. Right. And this idea then leads to a much more open sense of what the future can be. Now, there are a lot of, you might say there are a lot of ethical problems with this, but there's also a lot of institutional barriers as well. So one of the things that you mentioned, Andy, was this business about people doing experiments on themselves, right? Becoming their own laboratories, trying out new treatments and things like this, right? Or even volunteering to be part of experiments that do these things, right? But as we know, right, starting in the late 60s, early 1970s, right, we have these institutional review boards, which actually restrict, right, the ambitions, you might say, of human experimentation and increasingly animal experimentation as well. And so what that does is it kind of makes it difficult, unless you kind of go underground, right, to be able to actually explore those kinds of frontiers, even if you are, of this kind of risk-seeking mentality of the proactionary principle, which is kind of way transhumanists think about these things. And by the way, that's why it's not surprising that the kind of entrepreneurial mentality of Silicon Valley is closely aligned with this transhumanist point of view, right? And sometimes people are willing to go quite far in this. You may recall, maybe 10 years ago, Peter Thiel was talking about seasteading, right? Where you would basically park a boat outside of the territorial waters of the United States and Europe, so you were no longer bound by those kinds of ethical restrictions, and you could have your own floating island of Dr. Moreau, where you could do all kinds of crazy things with impunity, right? And one reason why that didn't go anywhere was because nobody would publish it. Because of course, if you're trying to publish scientific materials in scientific journals, you have to sign a statement saying that you are completely above board with your ethics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this didn't go anywhere actually. But in a sense, this is part of the tension as well. Regardless of what you think about kind of the ultimate ethics of doing this kind of proactionary thing, there's actually quite a lot of barriers at the institutional level with regard to how we do science. And it's in fact one of the reasons why people like Thiel and other Silicon Valley people are saying that our advances, in science have stagnated somewhat, right, over the past 50 years. And actually, John believes this too, right?
Yeah. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's the low-hanging fruit argument. Let me just push back a little bit against what you just said about transhumanism and all that. So at the end of science, I had this riff on transhumanism. I'm not sure if I used that term. I didn't use the term singularity. That wasn't really being bandied about at that point yet. But I talked about some of the visions of Freeman Dyson, for example, who is like sort of the godfather of modern transhumanism, and Hans Moravec and a few other folks. And I just had fun with it and imagined a future in which super intelligent machines are fanning out through the universe and discovering new things, kind of a Star Trek picture of the future that's pretty benign, and where it is more about truth and discovery than about power. The problem now, when I look at the people who are talking about the singularity, talking about superintelligence, talking about immortality and investing money in companies that are supposedly going to extend life, it's these Silicon Valley libertarian, super rich jerks whose completely illiberal fantasies are becoming all too apparent now. Space travel, which I used to think was kind of a cool thing, now it's just it's this plaything for billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. These guys have ruined all that for me. I just see it about an extension of their lust for power, and it's not funny because, again, they're so closely allied with the government, which is Trump is just trying to get rid of any restraints on new technologies, especially artificial intelligence. One of my concerns is war and militarism. One of my books, published about 15 years ago, was called The End of War. I was envisioning a time when we can get this ridiculous atavistic behavior behind us, where we like slaughter each other in huge numbers and have these gigantic arsenals. And as Andy mentioned earlier, nuclear weapons are making a comeback now. Yeah. I wrote The End of War when Obama was president. The idea of the end of war, it seems absolutely ludicrous now. We seem to be heading into a sci-fi future where if there are super intelligent entities, they're going to be waging war against each other in ever more imaginative ways. So again, this is part of my fear that the quest for truth, for knowledge, has just become tossed to the side. It doesn't really matter anymore especially when you're talking about large institutional science that used to be funded by the federal government. This is part of my fear. The science fiction visions have gotten really sort of dark and scary.
Well,
yeah. So Steve,
well, I should just say, for the record, every year I teach a rather popular course that covers both undergraduates and graduate students called The End Times. And it's about the history and philosophy behind this idea of the end times, because it's been around for a very long time and can happen in many different ways. And I assign to students an essay at the end, which is whether they're asked the question, should the world begin anew? In other words, to take a stand on the end times. Maybe it'd be a good idea to reboot, or maybe just to end it altogether, right? Because you don't need to reboot. You could just end it altogether. And some people go for the ending it altogether after they contemplate the history of humanity, and
voluntary extinction.
Yeah, well, yeah, something like that. Yes. And also sometimes it's understood in terms of where to, so you get the students to think very broadly about where does value come from in the universe, and is value just specifically located in human beings? Or is it something that's more general to life? And so a lot of the more environmentally oriented people, especially if they're sort of, the dark green ecological types, right, will often say, look, in order to preserve the diversity of life, you got to get rid of human beings. End of story. And once you get rid of us, everything will be fine, right? I mean, you actually get quite a few students who are, like that. But on the other hand, we have, I would say, most of the students argue for a kind of rebooting. So in other words, they're quite capable of laying out a kind of scenario under which the end of the world would come. And then the interesting question, and this is the thing they're really getting marked on, is how would you rebuild, right, depending on what you take the end to be, right? Will it be nuclear war? Will it be a cyber war? Will it be a global ecological catastrophe? I mean, there are all kinds of scenarios, right, that people, the superintelligence thing, right? And then the question is, okay, starting from there, and we operate on the assumption that no matter how bad the catastrophe will be, there will always be humans afterwards, right? Unless we're talking about total annihilation. So in other words, I take a kind of Herman Kahn stand on this, right? How bad can a nuclear war be? It might knock out a third of the population, but that still leaves a good 2-3 billion to build from, right? I mean, so in other words, I try to get students in that kind of mindset. But then the question becomes, what would you want to build back to, and how would you do it, right? Because you don't want to repeat whatever, the process that ended up leading to the catastrophe in the first place. And so what you find in this context is that students will be very imaginative about thinking, what forms of knowledge do we need and perhaps don't need, right? Knowledge, forms of knowledge that we depend on now, but largely we depend on them because of a certain kind of technological infrastructure that we're saddled in. But if that were to go, would we want to reinvent that kind of knowledge again, or would we want to move in a different kind of direction? And I get some really great essays. The reason why I'm saying all this is because you can do something intellectually quite interesting and non-nihilistic with thinking seriously about the end times that in a way I think is quite intellectually productive of people coming to terms with what exactly is valuable about being a human being, right? You put them in the liminal state, right? At the limit. And so I do think, John, even if you do think the world's going to come to an end, there's still some very productive thinking that can be done in the meanwhile.
I don't think the world is going to come to an end. My optimism is pretty hardwired. I'm a naturally cheerful person, even though intellectually I end up saying some pretty pessimistic things. I still convince myself that this period we're going through in the U.S. right now is temporary, and we're going to come out of it and go, phew, God, what was that about? Let's move on. And we're going to go back to some kind of progressive, regulated capitalism, which is what we had before, where there are these incremental advances toward improved civil rights for everybody, and people are pursuing happiness and in all these ways that they see fit, and we don't have these predatory capitalist warlords manipulating us the way we do now. I still think that might happen, although it's hard to see a road to that kind of future now. Maybe when somebody like Mandani becomes president of the U.S. I still believe in. I don't believe in revolution. Revolutions too often lead to absolute chaos and bloodshed and less democracy than you had before, more tyranny. So I'm hoping for some kind of incremental reform, still at this point, toward a kind of socialist Northern European way of handling some of these problems. We'll see. As long as this new surge toward militarism around the world that's been triggered by Trump doesn't get us, and we don't end up in World War III.
God bless you, John. God bless you.
There are some other trends that line up that here. Let me just remove this. There we go. That make me worried. I had missed the work of Jean-Baptiste Fressoz until recently. He had this book that came out a couple of years ago. Yeah, I've written about energy a lot and about the reality that what's seen as an energy transition, you see that term all the time, is actually still almost entirely energy addition. We are an energetic, addicted species, just like basically every species. It's one of the definitions of life. It's going out, finding energy and doing stuff with it. And this book really nails that more in the English translation, that we are just going to keep sucking it up and pumping it out and overheating the planet in ways that putting that rabbit back in the hole is going to be very, very, very hard. It's you have that, and then you have war. Maybe nuclear winter will solve it. My first big article, my first big cover story in a science magazine was on nuclear winter. But I wonder if we have this. We, when I say we, of course, I'm also talking about we, meaning people who are thinking about science and thinking about trends and not just doing stuff. If we end up in our own little silos and we miss some of the fundamental realities that are there and clear, like our energy habits leading to, especially with AI adding its energy needs, really getting way out of control. So that tempers my my enthusiasm or optimism for where the world's heading, along with the reality of war, along with some potential for engineering, malicious engineering of biological technology. I don't think we're going to wipe ourselves out, but I do think that there's some merit in Isaac Asimov's, one of my favorite stories of his, which is one of the darkest ones, Nightfall, where scientists discover that the world has a periodic double eclipse. So there are 2 or 3 suns, and so everyone's just lived lives of thousands of years with the sun, 24-hour sun. And they figured out there's a pattern. I can't remember the duration, where the 3 suns are eclipsed at the same time. And they put out the knowledge, and everyone goes, "Oh, fuck that!" And then the archaeologists are also digging, and they realize there's these past civilizations that have gone on that same timeline and then of course the sun's, I think the last line is the sun was setting, and all these people with torches are going to the observatory to kill all the scientists. I still find that story kind of appealing in a weird way.
If I can interject something, now I feel obliged to be hopeful in response to what you just said.
Here we go. Good.
And this shows that I'm kind of grasping at straws. The New York Times just had an article deeply reported on fusion research in China. Yeah. I don't know if you guys saw that. Yeah. I thought, because one of the first things I did when I was in journalism school back in 1982, our professor, Ken Goldstein, took us down to Princeton, and we looked at this tokamak reactor that was really impressive. Wow. And I thought, wow, this is going to happen really soon. That's what all these smart physicists there told us. And it of course never happened. And then I just became really jaded on fusion. And whenever any of my students writes about fusion, I go, yeah, okay, sure. But China looks like they're gonna, there it is. I'm really impressed with how you do that, Andy, by the way.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Google helps.
Yeah, well, and I thought, Jesus, so because this has always been something that should happen. The basic science has been in place for, I don't know, like 70 years at least. And so we just have to translate that, come up with the technologies to harness this form of energy. Just turns out to be really difficult. Maybe the Chinese will solve it, and maybe that will really help us out of our energy crisis. Although I don't know, because at least in this country, we don't even care about climate change anymore, sort of on an official governmental level.
But we care about China.
We care about China, yes. Well, if it takes international old-fashioned Cold War competition to get
there you go. Pull out the Herman Kahn.
And this is positive nuclear technology.
Sure, no, that's true. I mean, but I do. I in terms of what Andy was saying, and now I'm going to flip role and be a somewhat pessimistic, because I do think one of the problems with the people who, the transhumanists and the people who argue for the proactionary principle, often think that a lot of the real problems that we're currently facing, so for example, the idea of the energy consumption of artificial intelligence, which is a really significant environmental problem, it seems to me, and it's been really underplayed, but it's especially given that we're anticipating it'll be more and more involved in the infrastructure of our lives. I think there's, for example, too much faith being put on things like quantum computing and, changing the way in which the computations are happening that'll make it more energy efficient, when we're really, it seems to me, at least at this point, pretty far away from that. And then, of course, you get guys like Elon Musk, who part of the reason why he wants to take all these spaceships to other planets and other galaxies is because he's sort of half written off the Earth, and so he's kind of hedging his bets. Right. And so the idea, and there is this kind of, that is part of the Silicon Valley motivation for doing all of this liftoff into the cosmos. Right. Is that there's a sense in which you got to hedge your bets, because you never know whether this this climate thing may be real, and we don't want to be around when it happens.
Yeah.
You know, and as long as there's this feeling, at least, even if none of it is justified, there's this feeling that we can kind of get out of this somehow, right? That there is a fix to get out of these kinds of very deep situations. It's going to make the people with the money and the power complacent.
Yeah, it reminds me of remember toward the end of Dr. Strangelove, when it's becoming apparent that the world is about to end. Who is it? General Buck Turgidson, I think.
Yeah.
Says, well, we've got these underground bunkers, and we're all going to be fine, and there are going to be all these fertile young women who are supplied us. So, I think what you're seeing with Musk and Bezos and some of these other guys is this kind of fantasy that there might be an apocalypse, but they're going to ride it out into this really cool science fiction future.
Actually, Steve, does that come up in your students' calculations of the end times rebirth thing? Who has the power to do the rebirth?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of criticism of this idea. Interestingly enough, because I've come to believe, even though I'm someone who's seen as someone who advocates transhumanism, you might say, or at least justifies it, the attitude of students is not as strongly positive as you might think. And in fact, I tend to think, my own view, just based on my experience, that the people who are most attracted to the transhumanist stuff are kind of people of our generation, and people who are relatively wealthy and powerful already, right? And in a way, it's trying to keep that middle youth thing going indefinitely, right? That phrase, middle youth, right? Where you're sort of 45 forever or something. And so I think and students aren't necessarily buying that. And one of the reasons why they're not buying that is because when they look at their own life prospects, right, given, again, when they're born in history, right, they don't have memories of the 1960s and 70s and all that jazz, right? They don't see a lot going on, right? Even if there is no nuclear war, even if there is no climate catastrophe, there's no jobs. And AI is going to take whatever jobs are left. And so they don't have necessarily a lot of baseline optimism of the sort that transhumanism normally exudes. You really have to work on it. It's a very interesting feature. The students are actually quite sober-minded about these matters.
Hey, I don't know how much time we have left, but I wanted to make one final point. I've been thinking a lot about the end of science because it's the 30th anniversary, and I've been asked to write a couple of things later this year. And I just want to reiterate, I mean, of course, I'm always having second thoughts. I wrote a book I tried to learn the math underlying quantum mechanics during the pandemic. And I wrote a book about that called My Quantum Experiment. And that actually led me to think of quantum mechanics as this highly unstable structure, this weird thing on which modern science is based. And that led me to it sort of affirmed my feeling that the deeper we go into nature, the harder we study things, the more baffled we're going to become. And this is something I said at the end of science, where I had this, I sort of described this vision that was actually inspired by a drug trip of this cosmic computer at the end of time, trying to figure out where it came from, why there's something rather than nothing. And it finally realizes that there's no answer to that question, that's an absolute mystery. No matter how far we go, we'll never solve that. And I've become absolutely convinced that this is also the future of the quest for knowledge. The idea that we can actually solve this thing.
So the end of answers.
Yeah, that it was ridiculous. It's amazing that in the late 80s and in 1990s, you had some of the smartest people on the planet who convinced themselves that reality was a solvable problem, that we were going to figure this thing out through all these different branches of science, that were going to culminate in this giant revelation that would be comprehensible to anybody. This is what the physicist John Wheeler spelled out very eloquently. Now I see that as a pathology of really smart people, that if you look at science coldly, you realize that there's this gradual descent into befuddlement. This has happened in physics. It's happened in biology. If you read the book How Life Works by Philip Ball, he says that genetics is just kind of dissolving, and the whole DNA-based model of understanding life is becoming more and more untenable. Consciousness, there are like innumerable theories of consciousness, which means that there's no good theory. Which is kind of exciting for a science journalist.
Well, yeah. Steve, before you answer, can you go a little longer? Can everyone go a little longer?
Yeah.
Good. Because Steve, and I have some thoughts I want to inject here too.
Well, here's what I would say. It's at this point, I don't often make reference to Thomas Kuhn, though I've written about him and John's interviewed him. But I do think if you're talking about a paradigm in crisis, right, in science, right, the main characteristic of it is that there's been a lot of anomalies that are unsolved, right, and things that were originally thought to be quite simple to do, if you just apply the right kind of effort and rigor and so forth, turn out not to, in fact, reveal their secrets and, in fact, open up into a Pandora's box of questions and so forth. And this is part of what, in fact, leads to people losing faith, you might say, like in losing faith in Newtonian mechanics, for example, and then reaching for alternative radical proposals, right? Which then regrounds the science, in something different. And usually the something different is something that you might say was already available philosophically, but really did not have the backing of science and method and behind it. But when you do get into these crises where everything just breaks out into kind of unfathomable complexity, there is motivation to change the starting point, right, of where the science begins, right? And so you have a regrounding, a rebooting, effectively. And so that's kind of where I think we are, right? So again, it's a kind of a transition phase.
Yeah. Okay. Again, I like your optimism. I'd say that I think we're going to get pseudo revolutions where people decide that they have found a new paradigm that's going to solve a lot of these anomalies, and that it might become very popular. You get a lot of researchers flooding into that area, but it will be sort of like Freudian psychoanalysis. When we look back on it historically, we'll realize that wasn't the great insight that solved all these problems in psychology. It was kind of interesting, but a dead end ultimately. I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
I think, John, one reason why I think John may be right on this, at least more than had been in the past, is because in the past, you might say the institutional channels by which scientific knowledge was transacted was much more controlled, right? And so even in the period when Newtonian mechanics was in crisis in the late 19th century, right? I mean, the people who were having the arguments were kind of these academic guys. Some of them, some of the mavericks were sort of brought back into the center, but we weren't talking about totally fringe people having major audiences, right? However, now with the kind of fragmentation of scientific authority and these alternative channels by which people can participate in science in their own way, social media being very important in this regard, you can end up much more likely with the kind of scenario that John is talking about, where it becomes very difficult to kind of resolve the situation, because you end up getting all kinds of alternative sciences floating around, each of which have like roughly equal numbers of subscribers, right? And so how do you resolve that issue? And so I think that aspect of the epistemic media landscape, you might call it, has really change the situation to make the kind of scenario John is talking about more plausible.
Yeah. Oh boy. Although this does sort of open the landscape up to the endless, the line between conspiracy and science in the public eye becomes blurred, because Kennedy can spout all of his insane stuff, and I knew him when he was sane, and I used to go camping with him, and I look at him now, but sounds like a landscape where it'd be really hard for anyone to be able to discern. Well, that's
the challenge. That's the challenge for us. Those of us who are interested in the future of knowledge production, we have to somehow figure out what is an appropriate kind of regulation for this space that's emerging, right? I mean, I would say, if you want to be setting kind of knowledge policy, for the foreseeable future, this is where the action is, because we are going to have more and more of these kinds of disputes, right? I mean,
you're assuming that those in power are going to allow the regulatory structure to be.
Well, this is the thing. I know you're right. You're right. You're right. And God knows we might not even have a United Nations by the end of the decade. So right. So there's not going to be global regulation. That's for sure.
No. So that I assume I have to read your new book. But I assume that's part of what's explored.
Yeah, because when we talk about the post-truth condition, in a sense, we've now got to the heart of it, right? The post-truth condition is basically a situation where you got people operating from quite different standards of validity. And so very often they're looking at the same data, the same evidence, right? Because in a sense, you can just put that stuff out there and access it. But then the way they're framing it is radically different, right? What people consider to be important data versus not important data, what sorts of sources you trust, not trust, right? There is whatever consensus there used to be on this, right, has disappeared, and so this is where you start getting this kind of epistemic fragmentation, and that's the post-truth condition basically. And then the question is that regulatable, right, or manageable, or something like that?
I just have to mention that I wrote a column, I don't know, a couple of years ago, I guess it was, called "Conservation of Ignorance," which was inspired by this idea that comes from physics called conservation of information. Leonard Susskind has talked about this a lot in his writings on quantum mechanics. The basic idea is that everything that happens in a physical sense is preserved infinitely in the future. And there are reasons to believe that is bullshit. And so I was very skeptical of it. But then I thought, well, let's just assume that's true and play with it. And I came up with this idea that the flip side of conservation of information is conservation of ignorance. And the more I thought of it as a joke to myself at first, kind of the way I thought about the end of science as a joke at first. And then I suddenly started taking it seriously. And I realized that every time we decide the world is this way, we're missing all these opportunities to see it all these other ways. It's kind of like, that you've seen the gorilla illusion. When you're paying attention to one thing, a gorilla walks right through your face.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't even see it. So that's one kind of conservation of ignorance. A lot of our profound scientific principles, like Gödel's theorem and quantum mechanics, are about certain kinds of unknowability. Yeah. So anyway, and it just seems to me, if you look at civilization as a whole and human history, we sort of lurch from one form of stupidity to another, and we emerge from ignorance, and to ignorance we will return.
Well, there's this book, this book, Blind Spots. There's a book called Blind Spot that recently came out it's written by a philosopher and a scientist, and I can't remember the author's names, but it's called Blind Spot, and it's about this issue.
Hidden biases of good people.
There you go.
Yeah, I just found it. Another conversation to have. I mean, a few more thoughts. One, the hubristic or scientism aspect of science feels like it's part of the issue here in terms of even science's loss of respect or trust, which sounds weird, because if you want the world to trust science more, you think you should just convince them that it's really as important as we know it is. But I've seen examples over the years of this sort of hubristic aspect of science really, really undercutting the possibility of science becoming more widely embraced. And part of it, it just came up here, which is embracing unknowability, which is sort of antithetical to most scientists' personalities and mission statements. But like in climate science, I started writing years ago using the phrase known unknowables. I mean, we know about known unknowns because of what's his name?
Rumsfeld,
etc. But known unknowables on timescales that are relevant to policy abound in climate science. How fast is sea level going to rise between now and 2100? It's still like really, and how far? It's still deeply not understood. But if you go to the IPCC reports, the climate panel reports, they have a whole, they have this sort of rubric for saying when something is very likely, extremely understood. Global warming is happening, but they don't say ever it's extremely unlikely that we will know that in time for it to be meaningful to you policymakers, because that violates the whole idea of what the IPCC's role, the Nobel Prize winning IPCC's role is in advancing civilization. And I think there needs to be more of that. Origins of life. I don't know. I've never done a show on the origins of life. There's still this expectation we're going to get it someday, and the next IPCC report will have more answers, when in fact it generates more questions. So does science just need to kind of just get off its high horse?
Yeah. Well, I think science has been humbled. I'd say certainly from where it was in the 90s, when even I shared this view of it as by far the most noble human enterprise that was converging on some sort of true picture, beyond Thomas Kuhn and his paradigms, a true picture of reality. I still believe that, but the idea that we're going to actually get a hold of reality and have some sort of final definitive picture of things, I don't know if anybody believes that anymore. I think maybe Dan Dennett, who's dead now, was one of the last true believers in that sort of thing. Maybe Richard Dawkins still believes it, but now he's turned into some kind of weird crank, and he's in the Epstein files too. So yeah, Andy, you and I think are very fortunate to have become science journalists when science was at the absolute peak of its reputation, and you could really get excited about where it's going. Now in a way, it's a better time for journalism, but it's harder than ever to practice it because, the Trump administration is scaring journalists and
intimidating scientists too.
I think scientists are in a difficult position here. I'm someone who's very sympathetic to Karl Popper's view, right, where there's a sense in which, you never really get to the absolute truth, and what you have to do is always be self-critical, right? So I'm very sympathetic with this as a sort of general view about science, but it's not clear that it helps you get funding. And so this is where I think some of the hype comes from, especially as science has scaled up its operations, where it becomes necessary to have access to large amounts of funds and other kinds of resources, which do require the cooperation of politicians and policymakers. And of course, those people, being accountable to the people, will want the scientists to, in some way, show that what they're doing is worth it, right? And so there will be kind of pressure on scientists to be relevant, right? Be policy relevant, regardless of why they're in the science. And that then leads to the kind of hubris that you're talking about, Andy. And I think a really crucial moment was the COVID thing, okay? Because the way scientists were being mobilized, in the UK, it was very common when the prime minister came out to speak every day, there'd be two scientists flanking him as if they were the Praetorian Guard, and that kind of that, and given, how COVID worked out, which was, how should we say, messy. That really, I thought, did some serious damage, along the lines that we've been talking about here, right? Because in a sense, the politicians were hiding behind the scientists, and the science itself was in a way shutting itself down, and so it wasn't a good look all around. And so that's one of the reasons why you end up getting this kind of crisis of authority in science now. The COVID thing was a real nightmare in that regard.
Yeah,
public relations disaster.
And by the way, I wrote a piece toward the beginning of COVID about how, this wasn't a novel insight, but about how the whole left-right association with science had been reversed. So it used to be that the left, the sort of hippies, the counterculture, was suspicious of science, which represented pollution and nuclear weapons and all that sort of stuff. And the right, and the conservative right-wing people in the United States were pro-technology and industrial development and all that. And now it's like, I don't know where we are, but those polarities don't exist anymore. If anything, the right has become much more suspicious of scientific authority. So
sometimes using the rhetoric of the left, which is where Breitbart and Bannon come in, because they're very good at appropriating that kind of old leftist rhetoric for right-wing purposes.
It really is a great time to be a science pundit. I just want to say, apart from my pessimism that civilization is about, we're on the Titanic, it's going down, but I'm having a great time just watching what's happening.
Yeah. There was a question came in on LinkedIn. I wonder if women would add a new perspective to this conversation. Absolutely. I threw together quickly. I was intrigued by these guys have gone at each other and grown with each other intellectually for a long time. So that's why we're three men. I do work on having women on these panels too. George Thurston asks, public opinion surveys indicate that scientists and physicians are still among the most respected individuals. We can't be too doomist here. They still have an important but underutilized platform. And yes, the data do show this. So we've seen an erosion in trust. There are these issues with certain parts of the human community who will never trust messaging of that sort. I want to bring in one last voice, and this has been great. I could talk to you guys all day. But a long time ago, I spent a lot of time off and on with Pete Seeger in the Hudson Valley. And I was punished on my .earth blog in the New York Times by a bunch of scientists for quoting Pete Seeger on science and on faith in science. Why would I talk to a folk singer? But what he says, I think, is really fun. So hold on. Let me see if we can make this work. This was, I recorded this probably 15 years ago.
Well, my father put it this way. He said, scientists have the most dangerous religious belief in the world. And the scientists he's talking to, I have a page where he took a page to say, the scientist I'm talking to says, Charlie, I don't have a religious belief. I make all my decisions based on science, double-checked around the world, and then I move forward. Oh no, my father says, you think that an infinite increase in empirical information is a good thing. Can you prove it? And of course, they can't prove it.
Right. So that makes it an article of faith.
It's a religion. It's not a scientific belief. It's a religion.
Yeah. So what's interesting there, of course, he's talking about the value of science, not is science generating real facts, but is it always good? It's the good part. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about here gets at that question indirectly. Any last thoughts on Pete's warning?
I can see why the scientists were upset by that, although I love it. I mean, Pete Seeger is as close to an American saint as I can think of. But when people compared science to a faith, I like to say, where's the equivalent of a hydrogen bomb coming from religious faith? Science has altered our world materially in all these countless ways because, you can even be a postmodernist and have all these critiques of truth and knowledge, but science produces these things. It produces insights into nature, and it produces these technologies and gadgets based on these esoteric scientific theories like quantum mechanics. So that's why you can never entirely dismiss it. It makes progress. It tells us something every day that we didn't know before. But yeah, a lot of those things are disturbing, and a lot of the gadgets that it invents hasten our destruction.
I sort of picked up something a little bit different in what he was saying, especially his focus on the intrinsic value of infinitely more empirical data. I can see why this is kind of a weird faith, but it's a faith that I think one of the consequences of our post-truth condition is that this mentality that Pete Seeger is complaining about, or at least says turn science into a faith, is one that I think is quite prevalent. It's kind of spilled over into what we often call the conspiracy mentality, right? Where people just keep on digging deeper. They never have enough information, right? They want to find out more. They think there's something being hidden there, right? And this goes on endlessly. And one of the things when science is really doing its job, it engages in a certain kind of self-limitation, right? This is why you have things like method and you have tests, right? And the tests rule things in and out, and you don't just continue to look for data forever. You draw some lines under certain kinds of things. But I do think if you have this kind of mentality where you never have enough data, you always need more data, you could very easily be led into a conspiracy mentality where you think somebody's holding it back. Somebody's holding back what I need to know in order to figure out something. And so I could see, I think there, to a certain extent, this is kind of a pathology of our time.
I do think it's a pathology of our time. Well, we probably should end this discussion. We could always do another one. I think this is something I could do monthly, and bring in some other colleagues of yours and ours to broaden it a little bit. And I do love what John wrote about Steve 10 years ago. The value of intellectual provocation. Fuller is like no other transhumanist I'm aware of. At various moments, he sounds like a socialist, a libertarian, a Popperian, a Jesuit.
Yes.
If you make a Venn diagram of ideologies that Fuller at least partially inhabits, there would be only one person at their intersection, Fuller himself.
That's okay for me, Guy.
I think that actually applies to John.
Entry. Yeah,
I think that applies to John also. It's easy for intellectuals to be right, especially if they're safely right, not pushing the boundaries of received wisdom. What's harder is to be original, surprising, and challenging. Yeah, I tend to, I think back to my career, I've been trying to be, I'm in that sort of safely right arena, and I'm not sort of provocative enough. But I think listening to provocateurs and is a great way to explore these arenas where there's really unknowability, or at least the vestiges of that possibility. And it's been great to have you both here on the show.
I want to say something very positive about John. I've never said before, but I think it's quite useful in the context of, science writers and things like this. That John has he has a kind of connoisseur's sense of who to interview and how to frame topics. I mean, and if you look at this book, The End of Science, it's a great example of this. I mean, in terms of the range of people covered, the range of fields, and the way he does it, the way he picks, it's really it's connoisseurship, and that is really very important. I think with science journalism, where because there's so much science going on already, the journalist needs to have their own kind of take. They have to have their own kind of sense of what's the right way to get at this, and John is really good at that. He's really good at that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Before we close out completely, I just see a new comment here from Valerie O'Flynn, who gets she's pushing back on John a little bit, I think, about the science produces phenomena like nuclear weapons. Extremism and religious extremism is a weapon itself. She says more weapons to wield by religious factions and others who worship at the altar of power and money.
Yeah.
And,
think about Iran, right? We have this Iran nuclear deal thing going on, right? I mean, that kind of supports her case, I suppose.
Yeah. What the amazing thing about human history is that even wrong ideas, even bad ideas, can be enormously destructive. So, there's that.
Boy, well, it's great. This was great. John Horgan, Steve Fuller. Thanks for your time, and everyone who watched. And this can be watchable by anyone going forward on all these different platforms. Go to revkin.substack.com to get the post that I put up ahead of time. I'm going to do a new one once we're done with some of the links to stuff that we discussed. And these issues have never been more important. There's this concept of chronocentrism, which is we all think we're in the most important point in history. I think we actually are. Of course, 10 years from now, people will say, "Ah." So, Steve, thanks for all your work, and John too. John, we have to catch up face to face sometime soon back in New York. Okay, so that's it. That's a wrap. Ending the stream,